Origins of Papal Infallibility by Brian Tierney. Chapter 1, Part 2. Infallibility and Magisterium. Inerrancy and Indefectibility. Although the canonists did not set up the Pope as a second source of divine revelation, they did attribute to him a preeminent role as head of the Church. Their doctrine of papal primacy was based on the standard Petrine texts, especially Matthew 16:19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth, it shall be bound in heaven. The canonists were naturally aware that Christ promised this same power of binding and loosing to all the apostles at Matthew 18:18, and Gratian noted that he actually conferred the authority to remit sins on them all with the words spoken at John 20:23. Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you shall forgive, they shall be forgiven them. In later times, these texts led on to endless debates, some of which we shall have to examine, concerning the right relationship between the Pope and his brother bishops. But to the Decretists, their meaning seemed plain enough. Gratian explained that Christ chose Peter to be head of the Church when he promised to him the power of the keys, before all and on behalf of all. Johannes Teutonicus added that the power of a supreme pastor was actually conferred on Peter with the words spoken at John 21:17. Feed my sheep. Following the terminology of St. Augustine, the canonists often explain that Peter signified the Church, or stood as a symbol of the Church, in figura ecclesia, when he received the promise of the keys. In distinguishing between the authority conferred on Peter and that conferred on the other apostles, the canonists commonly observed that all were equal in power of orders, but that Peter excelled in jurisdiction, or in administration. The Decretists' discussions on this question led to the first clear-cut definitions of the distinction between jurisdiction, the power to govern, and holy orders, the power to administer sacraments as a priest. In their thought, the apostles received both powers from Christ. The power of orders was equal in all of them. Peter, however, received a superior power of jurisdiction. It is no part of our argument to minimize the claims that the canonists put forward on behalf of the Pope in the sphere of ecclesiastical jurisdiction during the period of 1150 to 1250. They certainly insisted that the jurisdiction of the Roman See included a right to decide disputed questions concerning matters of faith, and it is certainly true that this claim of the papacy provided an essential basis for later theories of papal infallibility. In Decretist writings, however, the idea of papal jurisdiction was sharply separated from the idea of papal infallibility. So far as the medieval canonists are concerned, there can be no question of maintaining that they took the doctrine of infallibility for granted, but never saw any need to articulate it because it had never been disputed. There is no argument from silence involved here. The canonists were not silent on this matter. They discussed over and over again the problem of maintaining the unerring faith of the Church, and invariably came to the conclusion that the Pope alone could not provide an adequate guarantee for the stability of the faith. Quote, "It would be too dangerous to entrust our faith to the judgment of a single man," end quote, one of them wrote. The canonists did not argue that an infallible head was necessary to sustain the faith of the Church. Rather, they maintained that, however much the head might err, divine providence would always prevent the whole Church from being led astray. The canonists were led to adopt this attitude in part by the nature of the source material that formed the foundation of their science. In Gratian's great compendium of canonical texts, drawn from every age of the Church's past, they found no assertion that individual popes were infallible, but they did find several cases of particular pontiffs who were alleged to have sinned and erred in matters of faith. Also, Gratian included in the Decretum a text asserting that the Pope's immunity from human judgment did not extend to cases in which he was found straying from the faith. The particular case that attracted most attention from the Decretists concerning Pope Anastasius II, 496 to 498. This Anastasius was a relatively blameless pontiff. He reigned at the time when the churches of Rome and Constantinople were divided by the Acacian Schism, which had arisen out of a late variation of the Monophysite heresy sponsored by the Greek patriarch Acacius. Anastasius went so far in trying to reconcile the heretics that, according to his enemies, he became tainted with heresy himself. After the Pope's death, they recorded the Liber Pontificalis that he had been, quote, struck down by the divine will, end quote. Gratian incorporated this passage into the Decretum and it was widely accepted throughout the Middle Ages as historically accurate and canonically authoritative. The medieval canonists knew nothing of Pope Honorius, 625 to 638, who really did blunder in handling the recondite details of the monothelite controversy, and whose case gave rise to interminable discussions in the 19th century controversies over papal infallibility. In medieval debate, Anastasius served as a sort of substitute Honorius. Dante duly found a place for him in the Inferno. Although the medieval decretists knew of cases of erring popes, they also had before them the whole body of texts, genuine and forged, from which the later theory of papal infallibility would be constructed. The decree Pastor Aeternus of 1870 started out from the primacy promised to Peter at Matthew 16:19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and then went on to argue that this primacy necessarily included an infallible magisterium by citing Luke 22:32. I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith shall not fail. Precisely the same juxtaposition of texts occurred in the decretum at Distinctio 21. Pastor Aeternus presented the formula of Pope Hormisdas, quote, in the apostolic see, the Catholic religion has always been kept undefiled, end quote, as evidence that papal infallibility had always been taught by the Church. Gratian included the same formula in the decretum, along with other texts asserting that the Roman Church had never erred from the path of apostolic tradition. To the ultramontane theologians of the 19th century, it seemed self-evident that a Catholic who accepted these scriptural and canonical texts must also accept the doctrine of papal infallibility. The medieval decretists showed how a wholly different Catholic ecclesiology could be built on the foundation of these same passages. The key to the understanding of this decretist ecclesiology lies in the canonist's conservative, patristically inspired exegesis of Luke 22:32. Theorists of papal infallibility from the late Middle Ages onward generally assume that Christ's prayer for Peter was intended to guarantee the unfailing faith of Peter's successors in the papacy. The decretists knew of no such interpretation. A typical comment is this of Hugusio, quote, that your faith shall not fail is understood to mean finally and irrevocably, for, though it failed for a time, afterward he was made more faithful. Or in the person of Peter, the church is understood. In the faith of Peter, the faith of the universal church, which has never failed as a whole, nor shall fail down to the day of judgment. For Hugusio and his contemporaries, the words of Luke 22:32 did not confer any gift of infallibility on Peter himself, let alone on subsequent pontiffs. They often noted that Peter's faith had indeed failed for a time, usually referring to his denial of Christ after the Last Supper. They also sometimes recalled that Peter had erred in his Judaizing policy, and that Paul had to rebuke him on this matter. According to their interpretation, Christ did not promise to Peter immunity from error in his leadership of the church, but rather the grace of final perseverance in the faith. Even if Luke 22:32 had been applied to Peter's successors in the papacy, it could hardly have formed the basis of a theory of papal infallibility, so long as it was understood in this sense. But in fact, Hugusio and his contemporaries did not apply the text to Peter's successors. They recognized that two interpretations were possible. Christ's words could be taken to refer to Peter alone, or they could be given a wider interpretation. But in the latter case, they referred not to future popes, but to the faith of the universal church. This was the common doctrine of the decretists. One encounters it over and over again in their works, and it was included in the universally accepted Glossa Ordinaria of Johannes Teutonicus. Moreover, when the decretists wrote that the universal church or the faith of the church would not fail, they were not thinking of infallibility in the modern sense, but more strictly of an indefectibility. Christ's promise to Peter was taken to mean simply that the church would always survive. It meant that the true faith would always live on, at least in some tiny remnant, even in an age of mass apostasy. This is brought out more clearly in another comment of Hugusio on Matthew 16:18. Quote, the gates of hell, vices and mortal sin, shall never prevail, so that there are no good persons in the church, whence Christ said to Peter as a symbol of the church, I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith shall not fail. Or, gates of hell means heresies and schisms, which likewise shall never prevail against the church. so that they totally pollute it. End quote. Similarly, Johannes Teutonicus wrote in Distinctio 19, quote, "The church cannot be reduced to nothing, for the Lord prayed for it, that it should not fail." End quote. Sometimes, in Decretus writing, the doctrine of indefectibility based on Luke 22:32 was associated with the pious belief that the true faith had lived on in Mary alone at the time of the crucifixion. Quote, "That your faith shall not fail, that is, the faith of the church, which is your faith. For the church has never failed because it existed even at the Lord's death, at least in the Blessed Virgin. The church can be small, it cannot be nothing." End quote. According to this interpretation of Luke 22:32, the unfailing faith promised to the church in Christ's words to Peter had survived in only one person at the time of the Passion, and that person was Mary, not Peter. The canonists' understanding of Luke 22:32 was decisive for their interpretation of the phrase, "The Roman churches never erred." Hugusio, we noted, observed that when Christ prayed for Peter's faith, the apostle stood as a symbol of the church. This idea was inherently ambiguous. It could mean that all the authority Christ conferred on the church was epitomized in Peter and his successors. Some canonists were inclined to develop their thought in this direction when considering the extent of papal jurisdiction. But in discussing the maintenance of the true faith in the church, the canonists invariably interpreted the idea that Peter signified the church in a disjunctive sense. That is, as implying a distinction between the whole Christian community, whose faith could never fail, and the person of an individual pope, who was a mere erring mortal, after all, and so only an imperfect symbol of the church. Typically, they explain that phrases describing an unerring apostolic see or Roman church could make sense only if they were taken to refer not to the pope alone, but to the whole congregation of the faithful. Hugusio commented on such a text attributed by Gratian to a Pope Eusebius. Quote, "The apostolic church has never erred. There is an objection concerning Anastasius, but perhaps this pope came earlier, or perhaps, and this is better, he speaks of the faith of the universal church which has never erred. For although the Roman pope has sometimes erred, this does not mean that the Roman church has, which is understood to be not he alone, but all the faithful. For the church is the aggregate of the faithful. If it does not exist at Rome, it exists in the regions of Gaul, or wherever the faithful are. The church can indeed cease to be, but this will never happen, for it was said to Peter, and in the person of Peter, to the universal church, that your faith shall not fail." End quote. Elsewhere, Hugusio wrote, quote, "Wherever there are good faithful Christians, there is the Roman church." End quote. Such views were commonly expressed by the Decretists. An anonymous French canonist observed that the unerring Roman church was the universal church, and an anonymous English one, that the church could not err simultaneously in its whole body. Laurentius wrote, quote, "Although the Pope, who can be judged for heresy, has erred, the Roman or Catholic Church, which is understood as the congregation of Catholics, has not erred." End quote. Similarly, Alanus, quote, "Even though the Pope erred, the faith endured in the Church, which is the congregation of Catholics." End quote. One Decretist found the proposition that the Roman Church could not err so improbable that he suggested the relevant text might have been written by an anti-pope. He fell back, however, on the usual doctrine that, in such a context, the term Roman Church had to be taken to mean the whole body of the faithful. Finally, we may quote a text of Johannes Teutonicus, which brought together the two strands of thought we have been pursuing, the distinction between the erring pope and the unerring congregation of the faithful, and the interpretation of Luke 22:32 as essentially a guarantee of the indefectibility of the universal church. Quote, "I ask of what church is it said here that it cannot err? It is certain that the pope can err, as in Distinctio 19, Anastasius, and Distinctio 40, si Papa. I answer, the congregation of the faithful itself is here called the church, and such a church cannot be, for the Lord himself prayed for the church. Distinctio 21, I have prayed for thee." End quote. Evidently, the medieval canonists were moving in a climate of thought very different from that of the 19th century ultramontane theologians. The canonists believed that popes could err, and could err in their official capacity as supreme pontiffs, in this case, as in the case of Anastasius. Of course, modern theology does not deny that a pope can err. But when Catholic theologians have to take note of errors promulgated by popes as heads of the church, they discriminate between official infallible pronouncements and official non-infallible pronouncements. The medieval canonists knew nothing of such distinctions. They were content to distinguish between the pope who could err and err in any of his pronouncements so far as they knew, and the universal church whose faith could never fail. Ideas akin to the modern doctrine of papal infallibility simply never occurred to them. Papal magisterium and the key of knowledge. In modern theology, the idea of the popes possessing a supreme magisterium, a supreme teaching authority, is sometimes associated with the doctrine asserting that one of the keys conferred on Peter was a key of knowledge. Thus Manning wrote in his pastoral letter of 1869, quote, "The supreme and ultimate power both in jurisdiction and in faith, or in the clavis jurisdictionis and the clavis scientia, was committed first and forever to Peter, and in him to his successors." End quote. Similarly, Bishop Gasser, speaking on behalf of the Deputation de Fide at Vatican Council I, referred to, quote, "the supreme magisterium of the pontiff, which is a part of his jurisdiction. For the jurisdiction of the pontiff is discharged with two keys, a key of knowledge and a key of power." End quote. The idea that the keys conceived by Peter conferred on him a power to teach with certain truth as well as a power to rule with legitimate authority was indeed of the essence of the ecclesiology that dominated Vatican Council I. Much earlier, the doctrine that the Pope possessed a key of knowledge had played a significant role in the development of the idea of papal infallibility. During the late medieval period, the doctrine had no connotation, however, in the earlier canonical tradition of the Church. This is another case where the medieval decretists started out from the same scriptural and patristic texts as later theologians, but derived quite different conclusions from them. The terminology used by Gasser, quote, "a key of knowledge and a key of power," end quote, is very ancient, but it was not until the 14th century that such language began to be associated with a doctrine of papal infallibility. In canonical works, and indeed in all medieval writing on the structure of the Church, a persistent tension arose from the fact that the same term, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, was used to designate both the supreme authority that inhered in the papacy and the general ability to remit sins that was diffused throughout the whole Catholic priesthood. So far as power was concerned, the canonists insisted that the promise of the keys to Peter, before and on behalf of, the other apostles conferred on him a unique jurisdiction as head of the Church. An obvious possibility existed of developing the idea of knowledge in the same way. It might have been claimed that just as the key of power conferred a supreme ruling authority on the Pope, so too the key of knowledge conferred a supreme teaching authority on him. In fact, however, the medieval canonists never propounded any such interpretation. The phrase clavis scientia is scriptural. It occurs at Luke 11:52, where Christ said, "Woe to you, lawyers! You have taken away the key of knowledge." End quote. Given their usual methods of biblical exegesis, it was natural for medieval scholars to relate this application of the word key by Christ with his use of the same word in the promise to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." The association between the two passages was transmitted to theologians of the scholastic period by Bede, who wrote in his commentary on St. Matthew that the keys received by Peter consisted of a clavis scientia and a clavis potestatis. Bede's terminology was repeated by Rabanus Maurus and later incorporated into both Peter Lombard's sentences and Gratian's Decretum. Thus, by the middle years of the 12th century, the idea that Peter received from Christ two keys, one of knowledge and one of power, was firmly established in the mainstreams of medieval theology and of medieval canon law. Gratian introduced his distinction of keys of knowledge and power at Distinctio 20 of the Decretum. His argument here dealt with the relationship between patristic writings and papal legislation. The question under discussion was whether the theological expositions of Reverend Church Fathers like Jerome and Augustine possessed as much canonical authority as the decretals of a pope. Gratian replied, quote, "It is one thing to settle legal cases, another to expound the scriptures diligently. In settling legal affairs, not only knowledge is required, but power also. Therefore, when Christ was about to say to Peter, 'Whatsoever ye shall bind on earth, it shall be bound in heaven,' He first gave to him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, conferring in one the knowledge to discern between leper and leper, that is, between sinner and sinner, and in the other, power to expel some from the church and receive others. It is clear that the expositors of divine scripture, even if they excel the pontiffs in knowledge, have not attained to the apex of their dignity. Therefore, in expositions of sacred scripture, they are to be preferred to the pontiffs. In deciding cases, they deserve to be placed after them." End quote. Gratian's meaning seems reasonably straightforward. He was trying to discriminate between theological interpretations and judicial decisions. Thus, an exegete, seeking to understand all the theological resonances of St. Paul's words, quote, "The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church," end quote, would do well to turn to the writings of the fathers. A judge deciding a marriage case would need to consult the appropriate decretals and canons. However, as several of the decretists realized, the distinction between theology and law could not be drawn so clearly as Gratian suggested in this text. Many of the Pope's judicial decisions could have doctrinal implications, most obviously in the cases of heresy. The canonists often pointed out that, where a definitive judgment concerning an article of faith was involved, the Pope's decision took precedence over the opinion of a church father. In this connection, the canonists often distinguish between the Pope's capacity as a private doctor and his official decisions as a Pope. As one of them explained, if the Pope and St. Augustine separately wrote books of exposition, each in his own room, we should certainly prefer Augustine's. But if the Pope pronounced definitively concerning a matter of faith, the papal decision was binding. Hugusio was of the same opinion, but struck a note of caution by observing that a pope ought not depart from the opinions of the fathers in his judgments. He added an unusual variation on the old formula, "In partem solicitudinis, in plenitudinem potestatis." Sorry. All right, back to the book. Where matters of faith were concerned, he wrote, the popes were called to a share of the solicitude, not to a plenitude of power. Gratian's Distinctio 20, his text on the key of knowledge and the key of power, became a locus classicus for the exposition of the common doctrine that the Pope's supreme jurisdiction included the right to pronounce judgment in disputes concerning the faith. But since the canonists all believed that a pope might err in his judgments, they naturally did not derive from Peter's possession of a key of knowledge any doctrine that an unerring teaching authority inhered in the papacy. Gratian himself had indicated plainly enough that it was the key of power, not the key of knowledge, that gave a special weight to the Pope's pronouncements. Hence, the authority that the canonists attributed to the Pope in matters of faith was authority of a supreme judge, not that of an infallible teacher. Hugusio considered the case of a Pope who was a learned theologian. If he contradicted another theologian, his status as Pope did not lend any additional weight to the views he expressed as a teacher. But all were bound to hold what he laid down as Pope in the decision of cases. If the Pope erred in deciding a case involving a matter of faith, the canonists were confident that the error would be corrected by the Pope himself or by a successor, as in the case of Anastasius, before the whole church had been led astray. None of the decretists based any theory of papal magisterium, let alone an infallible magisterium, on Gratian's text concerning the key of knowledge. Indeed, they do not seem to have known of any public magisterium conferred by Christ in the power of the keys. The only magisterium the canonists recognized was the teaching of private doctors whose authority depended on the intrinsic value of their works. The author of the Summa Elegantius summed up the prevailing views thus, quote, "There are three kinds of interpretation, princely, judicial, and magisterial. The first is binding and universal, the second binding but not universal, the third neither." End quote. When the canonists referred to a magisterial pronouncement of the Pope, they meant precisely that he was speaking as a private doctor, not as a supreme pontiff. All this is not to say that the canonists never discussed the clavis scientia. On the contrary, one finds many intricate arguments about this key in their glosses on Distinctio 20. The point is that they never considered the key of knowledge in connection with the public authority of the papacy. Their discussions concerning it always refer to the common sacerdotal power of the keys, the power of all priests to bind and loose in the sacrament of penance. In this sphere, A major difficulty had been posed by Peter Lombard. How could all priests possess a key of knowledge, he asked, when many of them were shamefully ignorant before their ordination and remained so afterward? Peter concluded that not all priests, but only learned ones, were endowed with a clavescientia, and this solution was at first favored by theologians and canonists alike. But it gave rise to a whole series of teasing problems. Did not every man possess some shred of scientia, which could be turned into a key if he received ordination? And if an ignorant priest acquired scientia after his ordination, did his newfound knowledge constitute a key? And how could scientia really be a key, when some men possess knowledge but no keys, while others possess the keys but no knowledge? Peter Lombard's doctrine that a key of knowledge, conferred by Christ on the apostles, descended in a haphazard fashion to some priests but not to others, soon came to be regarded as unsatisfactory, and around 1200, the canonists and theologians began to shape alternative theories concerning the meaning of the word keys, as used at Matthew 16:19. The canonists found it possible to dispense with the key of knowledge altogether. Grandolphus argued that the two keys were simply the power of binding and the power of loosing, while Hugusio asserted that there was only one key. Quote, "Truly there is only one sacerdotal key, the power of binding and loosing, but it is called two because of its twofold effect, to bind and to loose," end quote. In the first years of the 13th century, the author of the apparatus, Esse Vicit Leo, wrote that Hugusio's solution would be beautiful if it were true, but himself felt bound to adhere to the doctrine of a plurality of keys. Later canonists evidently found Hugusio's argument too beautiful to resist. The author of the Glossa Palatina quoted his opinion and added, quote, "I believe the key to be jurisdiction," end quote. Johannes Teutonicus similarly concluded, quote, "If you ask what the sacerdotal key really is, I say it is the sacerdotal power by which he binds and looses," end quote. This doctrine of one key, which was identified with the priestly jurisdiction exercised in the act of binding and loosing, was adopted by Raymond de Ponteforte in his very influential Summa de Penitentia, and by the middle of the 13th century it had come to be generally accepted among the canonists. Meanwhile, theological speculation had taken a different path. The theologians were unwilling to abandon the text of Peter Lombard, together with the authority of Bede and Rabanus Maurus that lay behind it, which asserted that a key of knowledge really existed. But they found unsatisfactory Peter Lombard's personal doctrine that only some priests possessed this key. Another solution was suggested by Rodolphus Argentinus. He distinguished between the personal qualities of a priest and the office he held, arguing that all priests received the clavescientia and with it the office of discerning, even though, regrettably, many of them were not discreet enough to discharge the office adequately. In the same way, a man lacking in prudence could receive the office of kingship by accepting the scepter, even though he was not really fit to be a king. The solution was repeated by back up here, sorry. He distinguished between the personal qualities of a priest and the office he held, arguing that all priests received the clavescientia, and with it the office of discerning, even though regrettably many of them were not discreet enough to discharge the office adequately. In the same way, a man lacking in prudence could receive the office of kingship by accepting a scepter, even though he was not really fit to be a king. This solution was repeated by Pravostinus, who found it probable enough. Stephen Langton rejected the argument and preferred another suggestion of Pravostinus, that a priest who passed only scanty knowledge received just a little clavescientia, a claviculum. Although this view was quite widely accepted, it was perhaps the most unsatisfactory of all the solutions put forward. And from the mid-13th century onward, the theologians came more and more to adopt the line of argument suggested by Rodolphus. The doctrine most commonly accepted by the middle of the century was stated very clearly by Saint Bonaventure in his commentary on the sentences. The term clavescientia, he explained, did not refer to a habitus, a quality of mind, but to an office. Any act of judging involved two stages. Firstly, an inquiry into the merits of the case, and then the promulgation of a decision. Hence, two kinds of authority were required, an authority to investigate and an authority to pronounce sentence. These two authorities were conferred by the clavis scientia and the clavis potestatis, respectively. All priests received both keys regardless of their personal worthiness or unworthiness. One finds essentially the same doctrine in Thomas Aquinas and in other contemporary theologians. Thus, by the middle years of the 13th century, two dominant theories had emerged. Most canonists held that no clavis scientia was included in the keys conferred by Christ on the Church. Most theologians held that all priests received a clavis scientia, but that it did not confer any particular gifts of knowledge or insight on the recipients. No one had suggested that the term clavis scientia could refer to a public power inhering in the papacy, which conferred an unerring teaching authority on the popes.